Close your eyes and picture a Viking woman. What do you see? If you're like most people, you see a warrior, a shield maiden with war paint on her face, an axe in her hand, standing shoulder to shoulder with men on the bloody shores of England. It's a beautiful, empowering image. It's the image Hollywood sells us, the one video games let us play, and the one we all want to believe. But it is a lie. Or, at the very best, it is only a tiny fraction of a reality so harsh, so unyielding, and so profoundly dark that history itself tried to bury it. Welcome to the year 920. The wind cuts across the frozen fjords of northern Europe like a sharpened blade. It slips through the cracks of turf-roofed houses, extinguishes the weak fires, and bites into the skin of those left behind. And in this brutal world, the ultimate symbol of female power was not a sword. It wasn't a shield. It was a key, a heavy, jagged piece of iron hanging heavily from a woman's belt. When the men pushed their longships into the dark waters, sailing off for trade, conquest, or slaughter, the village did not sleep. Instead, a massive, silent machine hummed to life, and the women were the engine. Archaeologists have dug up countless graves across Scandinavia, finding these iron keys strapped to the hips of female skeletons. It wasn't jewelry, it was the absolute mark of authority. Whoever held the key controlled the food. They controlled the treasury. They controlled whether the family would survive the winter or starve in the dark. It sounds like absolute power, doesn't it? A matriarchy hidden in the shadows of history. But before you romanticize this girl boss of the 10th century, you need to understand the crushing weight of that iron key. Because power in the Viking Age came with a terrifying cost. Imagine standing in the mud outside your longhouse. The frost is creeping up the timber. Your husband's ship has been gone for 6 months. You have no idea if he is feasting in a foreign hall or rotting at the bottom of the North Sea. You have 3 children shivering near the hearth. The harvest was miserable, and worse, the neighboring clans are watching you. They can smell weakness like wolves smell blood on the snow. This was the life of the Freya, the free Viking woman. Her authority was absolute, but her isolation was total. She was the CEO, the general, the judge, and the accountant of her estate. She negotiated with ruthless chieftains, managed the livestock, and prepared the defenses. If she failed, her children would die. If she showed weakness, her lands would be violently seized. She had rights that women in Christian Europe wouldn't see for centuries. She could demand a divorce. She could reclaim her dowry. She could stand before the Thing, the public assembly, and demand justice. But all of this freedom was born out of emergency. It was the freedom of a captain on a sinking ship. And if her husband never returned, the trap snapped shut. She would inherit everything, yes, but she also inherited his debts, his blood feuds, and his enemies. A wealthy widow was a target. Her own family would immediately pressure her into a new political marriage, passing her off like a chess piece to secure borders or alliances. She had a voice, but only if she spoke the words her clan wanted to hear. Yet, as exhausting and perilous as the life of the Freya was, she was the lucky one. She was the one remembered in the sagas. She was the one who received a proper burial. Because beneath her boots, living in the dirt and the shadows of her longhouse, was an entirely different class of woman. A woman history has completely forgotten, and her story is the stuff of nightmares. To truly understand the Viking world, you must strip away the romance of exploration and face a very cold economic fact. The Viking Empire was built on human trafficking. Slavery was not a side hustle. It was the backbone of their entire civilization. Between 1/5 and 1/3 of the population in Scandinavia were thralls, slaves, and tens of thousands of them were women. Picture this. You are a young girl living a quiet life in a coastal village in Ireland, or perhaps the Slavic steppes. One morning the horizon darkens with sails. There is screaming, fire, blood in the dirt. You are dragged from your burning home, thrown into the freezing hull of a wooden ship, and carried across an unforgiving ocean. When the ship finally docks, you step onto a frozen land where you don't speak the language. You are taken to vast slave markets in cities like Hedeby or Birka. There you are evaluated, handled, and sold. The going rate for a healthy young woman? A few cows, a handful of silver. You no longer have a name. You no longer have a past. You are a tool. The life of a female thrall was an endless loop of excruciating physical pain. She ground the grain until her joints bled. She scrubbed the floors, tended the fires, and carried the water. But the physical labor was only half the horror. She was completely stripped of bodily autonomy. She belonged to the men of the estate, to be used whenever and however they saw fit. There was no law to protect her. There was no family to avenge her. And here is the most disturbing psychological layer of this society. The woman holding the iron key, the free woman we just spoke about, was her warden. Two women living under the exact same turf roof, both trapped in roles they did not choose, but separated by an ocean of privilege. The free woman relied on the slave's broken back to keep her estate alive. The slave relied on the free woman's mercy just to breathe another day. There was no sisterhood here, only a cold, silent negotiation of survival. But even a life of endless labor wasn't the darkest fate a thrall could suffer. Because in the Viking world, a slave's duty didn't end when her master died. It was just about to get worse. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, archaeologists in Scandinavia kept making the same chilling discovery. They would unearth a grand Viking tomb, filled with weapons, jewelry, and the skeleton of a powerful chieftain. But right beside him, perfectly preserved in the soil, was a second skeleton, a young woman. For decades, romantic historians assumed these were wives, dying of a broken heart, or perhaps falling in battle beside their husbands. But modern DNA and bone isotope analysis shattered that fairy tale. These women were not local. They were foreign. They had no battle wounds. They were perfectly healthy right up until the moment the chieftain died. They were murdered. In the year 922, an Arab diplomat named Ahmad ibn Fadlan traveled north and witnessed a Viking chieftain's funeral with his own eyes. His journal entries are one of the most terrifying documents of the Middle Ages. He describes how, when a leader died, his slaves were asked who would die with him. A young female slave volunteered, though in a society where she was property, the word volunteer is meaningless. For days she was treated like a dark goddess. She was given fine clothes and intoxicating, fermented drinks. She was paraded through the village. And then, the ritual began. Ibn Fadlan watched as the girl was lifted over the edge of a wooden frame, hallucinating and terrified, looking into the afterlife. She was taken into a tent on the burial ship. The men of the village beat their shields with wooden sticks so her screams could not be heard. And there, an old woman, the priestess of the ritual, horrifyingly known as the Angel of Death, ended the girl's life with a dagger. The ship was burned. The girl was reduced to ash, forever bound to serve the man who had bought her, used her, and ultimately destroyed her. When you look closely at this darkness, it feels impossible to find any light. How did any woman, free or enslaved, maintain her humanity in a world that viewed her as a political token, a breeding machine, or disposable property? They did it through a magic that no man could control. The Vikings did not build pyramids. They didn't leave behind vast libraries of stone. Their world was held together by threads, literally. We tend to look at weaving as a quaint domestic hobby. But in the year 920, the loom was a machine of immense economic and mystical power. The women of Scandinavia produced a woolen cloth called vadmal. This wasn't just fabric for clothes. It was the currency of the North. It was legally regulated, traded for silver, weapons, and slaves across Europe. Every time a woman sat at the loom, she was printing money. She was funding the very raids that made the Vikings famous. And because it took years to master the complex patterns, these master weavers possessed a monopoly on the economy. But they wove more than just wool. They wove the very fabric of time. In Norse mythology, the universe is controlled by the Norns, three ancient female beings who sit at the roots of the world tree, spinning the threads of fate. Even Odin, the all-powerful, one-eyed god of war, was terrified of them. He could not alter the threads they spun. This mythological respect bled into the real world. Scattered across the frozen landscape were the vulvas, the wandering seeresses. These women operated outside the strict social hierarchy. They carried staffs of iron. They wore cloaks of dark feathers. When a vulva walked into a Viking village, the world stopped. Fierce warlords who had slaughtered hundreds of men without blinking would bow their heads and offer her the high seat in the hall. They paid her in silver to predict the harvest, to curse their enemies, to tell them if they would survive the coming spring. The vulva commanded a primal, terrifying respect. She was the one woman in this brutal society who could look a king in the eye and make him tremble. This is the ultimate paradox of the Viking world. A society that could drag a terrified slave girl into a tent and murder her for a funeral ritual was the exact same society that believed the universe was controlled by female magic and that bowed in absolute reverence to wandering grandmothers. So, who was the Viking woman of the year 920? She was not the sword-swinging action hero of modern television. She was far more complex. She was the solitary manager holding the keys to survival in a world that wanted to freeze her. She was the invisible slave, whose broken back built an empire. She was the tragic sacrifice in the dark earth. And she was the mystical weaver, spinning the fate of gods and men alike. She lived in a world that tried to crush her under the weight of winter, blood, and iron. But she refused to be erased. We owe it to her, to all of them, to strip away the Hollywood makeup, to look past the myths and to stare bravely into the harsh, freezing reality of their lives. Only then can we see their true strength. If you were dropped into the year 920, which of these lives do you think you would have lived? Could you have carried the weight of the Iron Key? Tell me in the comments below. And if this journey into the dark corners of history shifted your perspective, hit the subscribe button. Because the past is always darker and always more fascinating than we are taught. Stay curious, and I'll see you in the next chapter of history.